Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome to Liberty Mail. I'm Aaron Jenks, and we have a special interview episode for you today. Our guest is Hunter Oswald. Hunter, thank you for coming on today.
Hey, thank you so much.
And we're being sponsored by the Institute for Faith and Freedom, which Hunter is also a part of here at Grove City College. He is one of our student fellows on the marketing side.
Yep.
And then he's also involved on campus with YAF, Young Americans for Freedom, working as a position of the secretary for that club on campus. But Hunter's done some good work. You've worked on the conference this past week a bunch, right?
Oh, boy, yes, I did.
Mm-hmm. And so if you haven't seen or you didn't know about that conference and you're listening right now, please, we're going to be posting over the next couple weeks. Grace had a bunch of interviews that she got down. I was a little sidetracked with some wisdom teeth coming out, and so I wasn't able to do the interviews I wanted to. But even we have Abby Johnson was on campus, and I believe, is that video going up? Does anyone know? But so hopefully that gets out to you guys on YouTube. But thank you for checking in today. And today, Hunter, we're going to be talking about the weaponization of our institutions. And let's just break the first couple parts down before we hop into examples and the history of this. So first, can you give me a solid definition of weaponization, and then talk about the institutions that you're looking at?
Yeah, so when we hear the term weaponization, we hear a lot of like, oh, something's being weaponized. Well, the definition that we should be using when it comes to weaponization is transforming institutions, structures, or whatever into a offensive means against something else. So that could be, turning a car, when we say like weaponization, you turn, like, for example, a car into, a battering ram. It's far out there, but at the same time, what you are doing is transforming something for a means of attack.
But highlighting it in the political kind of strategic sense, right?
Yeah, and so like when we hear about weaponizations of the institutions, what it is we are seeing a fundamental transformation of current institutions into a means of attacking, say, a political opponent or whomever that is supposed to attack.
And I know we've talked about this before, and on my end, some research, your end, definitely a little bit more knowledgeable, but it's so interesting that you put it back to at least like 60 years ago. And so who do you see kind of the first, you talked about maybe presidential figures kind of exercising this weaponization of institutions first. Where do you see that occurring in the first kind of examples?
So where we really start seeing the weaponization of legal institutions starts with the IRS, surprisingly enough. And where we see that is in the 1930s with Huey Long and FDR.
Okay.
So when FDR first came into office, obviously he wanted to promote the New Deal, and Huey Long was at the time kind of a weird opponent because he kind of supported aspects of it. In fact, he would argue every man's a king, where he was advocating for like $1,000 per month of kind of a UBI for the time.
Universal basic income, you're saying?
Yeah, okay. UBI, universal basic income. So what he did is, Huey Long comes along, he's like, I am not going to support any of your stuff unless you support my stuff. And FDR is like, it's my way or the highway. Mm-hmm. And so Huey Long threatens to challenge him in 1936. So obviously an election year, and surprisingly enough, Huey Long had enough support that if he was still alive, he was assassinated a few months before the nomination, but Huey Long could have actually taken out FDR in the primary season. So in order to stop Huey Long, FDR decides, you know what, I'm going to use elements of the IRS to kind of scoop around kind of the background of Huey Long.
And what specifically? You're saying assigning agents within the IRS to specifically look into, or creating maybe a group agency within it? Or how does that work? Is it more individual, or as an institution do you see it corrupting it?
So it's kind of a bit of both. So FDR had a lot of connections in the IRS. So the structural aspect is the tax code. So there's been a ton of laws, a ton of regulations around the tax code. So at the time, Huey Long had been found for doing some sketchy stuff for his taxes, and FDR kind of manipulated that to his advantage. So looking at you didn't follow this aspect of the tax code. Well, you didn't follow this aspect. So Huey Long was kind of an easy target from the start. So FDR is like, okay, I'm going to send a couple of my personal agents out there to kind of tell them, hey, if you don't stop what you're doing, we're going to basically humiliate you in public. We're going to go trudge you through the courts. We're going to trudge you through everything.
Blackmail.
Yeah, pretty much blackmailing.
Okay.
So that's pretty much the blunt way of saying it. But Huey Long does give up. And so that's kind of where we start seeing the structural aspect of things as well. Because, sure, it's personal agents by FDR, but over time it's kind of restructuring towards the party in charge. Because it's like, it's not just political opponents within, say, the Democrat Party at the time, but how to use it against, say, the other side. And so that's kind of where we start seeing. So from moving there, we start seeing the FBI with John F. Kennedy. And so where we start seeing this, in fact, I wrote it down, it's the Ideological Organizations Audit Project, which under the JFK administration, there was kind of this focus on individuals that had conservative views that JFK didn't like. So looking at the John Birch Society, the certain Christian ministers that have been critical of him because obviously he, from a Catholic background, he faced a lot of criticism from Protestant groups. So he kind of took that, kind of went further and just said, you know what, sure, you may criticize me, but you know what, I'm in charge now, so I can basically do whatever I want. And the problem was, it didn't stop there. So it started out with conservative groups, so making sure like they couldn't get tax exemptions for their organizations. Well, people were kind of leading on and find out like, oh, this is obviously political targeting. So JFK quickly changes route and kind of includes left-wing organizations such as the Black Panther and other left-wing groups at the time.
So when you say he switched his route, when you've been looking into this subject, are there legal repercussions in any of these examples where someone did get their hand stuck in the so-called cookie jar of kind of manipulating and almost pretty much strong-arming their position towards their benefit, right? Is there that legal repercussion, or is this a gray, murky area of government?
It is a gray, murky area because, like, for example, with the FBI at the time, say during JFK, that's where you start seeing a lot of involvement with the communists, investigating individuals that had communist roots. So it's kind of like the broad brush of the time. You're, okay, well, we're investigating you because we suspect you're in anti-government activities. So obviously it's not like a simple, we can just do willy-nilly. It's like, okay, since we have such a gray area that we're dealing with, basically we kind of play it off as whatever. So that's kind of what, if you get your hand stuck in the cookie jar, I mean, you're essentially just peeing off these major political figures, and that's just the nicest way of saying it because it gets even worse over time. So that's the best way of describing it.
And I thought it was most interesting because when I think about this, I think about the individual's character, and specifically in the president. And so looking at the one example that you brought up, or at least on our work and research, is Richard Nixon, and to where he would legitimately, I so think it plays into your personal character in this is, okay, will I exercise this authority to be, to strong on my opponents, but to where Nixon would write down the list, as you said, an enemy list, or was it the freeze list?
It was the freeze list, yeah, because in fact, Nixon when Nixon entered office in 1968, and actually, 1969, he gets elected in 1968. He gets into office in 1969. So off the bat, he has this weird paranoia of who's after him because this man did not have let's just say, the most successful political career after his vice presidency with Eisenhower. So he gets in, and what we start seeing with Nixon is he starts slowly targeting people. And in fact, it got so bad, the lists, which were at the time just simple post notes, there were so many post notes across the White House that Nixon had created that were enemy list or freeze list that staff members were actually trying to pick up as throughout the day because he wrote so many individuals, and that included like inter-party individuals within the Republican Party. It included activists, communist leaders, and named almost everybody you can name across the board. So Nixon's a very unique figure because when you're looking at today's weaponization of our legal institutions, a lot of it stems from the Nixon administration, from Watergate, because where we start seeing is the term black jobs. And black jobs are essentially this kind of covert term of basically political espionage. And the term derives from agents who would have black bags where they would put in like wiretapping stuff, everything they needed to engage in these operations. So Nixon's kind of the big one when looking at today's, weaponization, because because it's normally not a figure you would think, oh, it's maybe a left-wing individual, but no, this is a man of the right. So this isn't just a right or left issue. This is just a power issue in the core of it.
And we can hop in a minute to more recent examples of the weaponization that you're looking at. But in my mind, I think anyone listening is saying, well, is there pushback like amongst legislators to where we see this over the past? You said, oh, okay, we can trace it back to 1930. Is there pushback from legislation or think tanks in D.C. that see this because another individual and maybe even those working in the executive branch say, well, this is a means that is at our discretion, and so why not just exercise this? There's no legal. It's a gray area for some of us, but hey, there's no legal precedent saying that we can't do this.
Yeah, so when it comes to like think tanks today or anybody that's talking about, how are we going to fight against this? You hear a lot of legislators today, oh, we're going to do like a Frank Church style committee. You hear individuals like Jim Jordan, Ted Cruz, oh, we're going to have this kind of, Frank Church style. We're going to investigate the FBI. We're going to investigate the CIA. It's really hard to do because it's that gray area of national security as well. And that's where we start seeing like the whole kind of referring back to Watergate with the United States versus Nixon, where it's like, okay, the ability to turn over tapes that might talk about illegal activities. So it's definitely where we're seeing today, even still, it's a lot of gray area. So looking at, how are things going, think tanks have obviously been critical. I mean, we're seeing this a lot with Heritage Foundation, elements of AEI. So we are definitely seeing a broad consensus of there are issues at hand with weaponizing legal institutions. And so, I've heard a lot of talk, but I don't really see a ton of action just because of the nature of the situation. It's still ongoing.
Is there talk within the institutions themselves of kind of reform or at least push back towards certain individuals who do act maybe like in this inappropriate or they conduct themselves inappropriately like this?
Yeah, it's weird because there's not a ton of people internally that are obviously speaking out because it's kind of like you're exposing yourself that, I agree, I've been doing all these illegal things. But what we have seen is kind of whistleblower situations. So I know recently during an interview on Fox News, a woman came out who was from the FBI talking about, the political agendas that are being promoted in the background, kind of, how do we change the structure to advance, individual agendas for, say, X administration, whether that's Trump or Biden or Bush or Obama. It's just it's all over the place. So we don't see a lot of people coming out saying, oh yeah, all this stuff is happening because it's so incriminating. And so
because I think it comes down to either two groups of people who can potentially push back and solve it, and it either comes from within the organizations as a cultural movement of a work culture where we do not accept this, we do not advocate for this, and we will not tolerate this within the workplace if your connections do not come first and come into play of influencing how you carry out your position. But then also just as I think Cruz says in this book that a lot of your work got from, is that, okay, well, it does come back again, which so many things in America is, okay, if general consensus among the American people can be enough of a pushback, that puts pressure on legislation and on legislators to then also get some action done.
And I agree. That's kind of what the whole idea is at the moment is we're going to tell our congressperson, whether that's senator, House representatives, or just anybody we know in higher up saying, hey, we know this is an issue. Please fix it or else. And so, people within the institutions, I would argue, is very unlikely that's where the reform is going to be just because it is so ingrained. Because, again, the history is 1930s. Again, we're almost pushing 100 years to where there's been plenty of time for change and all that. So it's kind of at this moment very entrenched within the system itself. And obviously it's very much incentivizing for those who are in charge of those organizations and institutions to basically say, you know what, we're not going to relinquish our power. We're just going to keep it because it benefits us way more. And I mean, that power has just been continuing to accumulate over time.
So talk to me about some current day examples, or even in the past 20 years, where you're saying that power has risen to a level where it's kind of scary, or it's enough where it draws a or it crosses the line to where the American people and people like you push back.
Yeah, so there's plenty of examples. I would say right off the cuff, one of the big ones, interestingly, was many of the audience might know, but Scooter Libby. So Louis Scooter Libby was the chair for the vice president at the time, which was Dick Cheney, and so he helped, with the transition. Well, one of the things, this is during, I would say before Iraq. This is so right around 2003. What we start noticing is a certain individual by the name of Robert Novak. So he writes a column for the Washington Post, and it talks about two government officials about information regarding the lead up to the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. And what happens is there's kind of this major scandal of, okay, who released this information? Because, and this eventually what many people would become known as the Palmer affair, which is Valerie Palmer, who was a covert agent of the CIA, leaked out information regarding certain key operations of Iraq. And
as a whistleblower kind of leaked out, or
kind of
how does that work?
Kind of loose lips sink ships situation.
Okay.
So individuals talking, and Scooter Libby, or pardon me, Libby Scooter, depending on how you say it. I've heard people say it otherwise. Mm-hmm. But Louis Libby basically is kind of confronted on both ends because it's like he knows these individuals, but also Robert Novak. So what we start seeing is elements of the administration that did not like the new Bush administration kind of carry over from Gore, kind of says, hey, we're going to take this guy out kind of as a payback for 2000. So this kind of leads into a cascade of many, many problems within the Bush administration early on. In fact, it leads to Scooter Libby being in prison for a while. Bush commutes his sentence, and it doesn't take until 2018 for Libby to be pardoned by President Trump. So that's kind of one of the earliest examples, and I think that's a very unique situation because it shows even the people in power doesn't necessarily have to be the people in charge of these institutions. These institutions can kind of do their own thing and basically say, well, we kind of feel like it because we have our own agendas. So that's kind of one of the early ones. Another big one has been Joe Menendez. So Democratic senator from New Jersey, Joe Menendez, early in 2000, this would have been 2015, is when we start hearing about the Iran deal. So obviously under the Obama administration, this was the big effort to promote, the Iran deal, and we're going to have this agreement that prevents Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Joe Menendez looks at the deal and is like, I don't agree with this. Well, it gets even worse because what we start seeing is Obama actually gets a hold of Eric Holder. And Eric Holder basically puts on what we see somewhat similar to the Trump administration's Steele dossier. So what happens is there's basically all these claims fabricated against Joe Menendez, saying that he was engaging with prostitution, that he was taking illegal bribes, that he was doing all these things that were obviously false. But in the end, people thought it was true. So it kind of dimmed down the opposition towards the Iran deal.
Now, were those accusations being thrown out from the DOJ, from Eric Holder, or were they being thrown out to media outlets?
They were actually being promoted by the DOJ under Eric Holder. And Eric Holder was told to do this under the direction of the Obama administration. So this is, again, kind of goes back similar to the FDR Huey Long situation. That is to say, in order to maybe get things done, we have to silence opposition within our own ranks. And Joe Menendez, fortunately enough, they do the investigation. Turns out all this is basically false, and people leave. So I think that example alone illustrates that, again, this isn't a left-wing or right-wing issue. This is truly an American issue because it's those in power, regardless of party affiliation or even ideological affiliation. It is most about power.
Now, again, is this an abuse of power, or is this authorities exercising what discretion they can, and what is at their hand, the means at their hands?
In the end, this is an abuse issue because, again, those in charge, because let's face it, the federal government hasn't decreased in size in the past few years. So obviously this isn't this is a national security issue. It is truly an abuse of power.
And I tend to agree with you, and I think there's the moral obligation behind it too. And it plays down to we don't want anyone doing this, period. Like you said, it's being even on people doing it within their own administration, doing it to the opposite side, and it does come down to an abuse of power. Now, with the Eric Holder situation, the DOJ, I think it's super interesting because the DOJ has come maybe under light again in the past 8 years. Can you talk about, is it any of the same actors, do you see it, or is it just, does it really just come down to networking and, okay, in different situations, and this is just, it just happens to be the DOJ again in the past couple of years? Yeah,
so a lot of it is, I would argue, is networking because a lot of it is people from prior administrations carrying their jobs onward. So, obviously, Eric Holder is no longer the Attorney General, and then it's like, okay, we have somebody new. Well, regardless of those positions, all those unelected officials that have been there since, the Bush administration, who then worked on the Obama administration, who worked then under the Trump administration, who maybe now work in the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. It's those individuals that really we start seeing kind of that networking, because it's regardless of kind of who they are appointed by, they're kind of there. There's that they're not elected, they're not anything. They just kind of get appointed and then they kind of go on their merry way. Well, all those networks have been developing again for how many years, and so when somebody tries to come in and says, "Oh, we're going to dramatically change the way we're doing things," that gives power back to the people. It's like, why would I do that? I have all this power right now that I can basically do whatever I want for whatever reason. So what we start seeing is it's definitely a networking. So all the abuse in the past few years has been mostly due to just that in-depth corruption.
Mm-hmm. And I also see, like, in all these situations, the actual means of targeting and, like, the weaponization, it comes down to either, like, a smear campaign or maybe extending a time frame, making someone under pressure. There's no real, I would say, like, causal or like physical changes within the legal system. Is that correct assessment to think of all these? Because it feels like someone has to make that actual crossover to where someone can be legally liable. And right now it's just kind of these smear campaigns or kind of changing the rules a little bit while playing the...
So I would definitely say it's kind of a bit of both, because a big part of it starts from, I would say, just the change of the institutions themselves. For example, like the IRS, that being I would argue, a legal institution, because that involves the tax code. How do you properly enforce the tax code? How do you address certain key issues? Think of it this way. I want to say it was Rand Paul that actually addressed this issue, that said every day when we look at taxes, every year, every person probably commits 3 to 5 counts of tax evasion or tax fraud. And the problem is but the thing though is those issues are so minute, nobody actually enforces them. Only time they get enforced is when it involves a big political figure or some kind of opposition to the current people in charge. So, I mean, a great example of this would be Catherine Elbridge, who was the founder, True the Vote, which is a election integrity group. Well, they got in, they're a conservative group, but they're very bipartisan. In fact, they've gone after both Democrats and Republicans. But yet the IRS still targeted them. Why? Because they were going after individual electors, individual politicians that had connections with the IRS at the time. And they're like, hey, try to silence them. And so this would have been under the Obama administration. Okay. So some of the Democratic individuals were saying, hey, we know we're doing some kind of sketchy stuff, but, also the other side as well. So it kind of goes, again, it goes both ways. Mm-hmm. But it came across to a point where it's like they're kind of leading on to something. So, again, that just illustrates, just those minute things that we think, oh, nobody's going to force it. Well, then they become enforced. So it just shows
when it becomes useful
Yeah.
to those gripping power. Now, we're running low on time, but do you have any kind of wrap? Because, we said that we both think that there's two maybe groups that can solve this problem. Is there, what group or what institutions do you see working to solve this?
Yeah. So I would argue really the only way we're going to solve this is the people themselves. Because, again, this is a nation that has a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So when it comes to finding solutions, well, last time I was on here, we discussed about convention of states. And I know one of the big sources of the situation has been, how do we reduce the size of government? How do we restrict federal power? And again, that's kind of ties into this as well, because ultimately this abuse of authority within the legal institutions is because of all the continual increase in the government power. So through whether that's a convention of states, creating proposing new amendments to the Constitution to kind of ring in that power, that's one way. Another thing is, especially you can do this on the local level, and that is, running for school boards, running for, office, or just being aware of what's going on in your local area. Because again, we think of this as only a federal issue. No, it's also a state and local issue, because this corruption has seeped down so far, not just from the federal government, but just to state governments, whether that is legislators for pork barrel projects, or if it's, local elections because of school boards trying to get more aid. So there's a lot of ways in which we can address this situation. So I would argue, in the end, this is only a solution that can only be solved by the people.
Man, that is such a classic answer in the past 22 years of my life, to where personal involvement in the community is seemingly the answer, but if you get involved, man, I'm like, in my head right now, I'm like, oh gosh, we can't just sit here and talk about it. So yeah, in the next 20 years, we better do something in our local community.
Yeah.
If we're saying this on podcasts, we got to do something in the next 20 years.
And I think Winston Churchill, and for those of us who are like, I'm not sure if I can really do it. I don't have any clout in the community. I always tell myself, and even anybody, Winston Churchill famously once said, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It's the courage to continue that counts." And in the end, if we are truly going to solve the issue at hand with our institutions, it must be from the courage of the people to restore a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
I run through a brick wall right now. Cut off the podcast. No, Hunter, that's great. I appreciate you coming on today and talking about it. Anyone else listening, again, please go to the Institute for Faith and Freedom's YouTube. You can find it just at that name, and you're going to find anything from the conference this past week. You're going to find Hunter and I's conversation. You can find Hunter's past interview. We name-dropped the Convention of States. But yeah, please leave a like and subscribe. And Hunter, again, thank you for coming on today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
For more information on the Institute for Faith and Freedom, visit faithandfreedom.com.